It was Christmas Eve in Maple Creek. Snow fell quietly against the windows as veteran Jack Carter sat by the fire, reading a story to his little girl, a child born with a disability, yet braver than anyone he had ever known. Then, suddenly, a faint scratching echoed from the door. When he opened it, the freezing wind swept in, along with a wounded German shepherd, trembling, barely conscious, carrying a tiny, lifeless puppy in her mouth. The little girl gasped, "Daddy, please, we have to help them." He didn't know where they came from, or what kind of horror they were running from, but the pleading look in the dog's eyes and the way she shielded her pup broke the soldier's heart. And when he brought them inside, he had no idea that this Christmas night would become a moment he would carry for the rest of his life. If you believe that even in a broken world, compassion still has the power to heal every wound, stay with us and subscribe to hear more stories that touch the heart. Wishing you peace and kindness wherever you are. Snow fell in hushed layers over the quiet town of Maple Creek, Montana. It was Christmas Eve, and the world seemed to hold its breath beneath the steady rhythm of the storm. In a small wooden cabin at the edge of town, a dim orange glow flickered from a fireplace where Jack Carter, a 42-year-old veteran, sat with his little girl. Jack was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark brown hair streaked faintly with silver, the kind that told stories of service and sacrifice. His olive-green field jacket hung loosely on his frame, the same one he'd worn through years of patrols overseas. A black baseball cap rested on his knee, its embroidered word "veteran" faintly glimmering in the firelight. Across from him sat Emily, his 5-year-old daughter, fragile yet radiant in spirit. She wore a light pink winter coat trimmed with fur, a beige polka dot dress, and small black shoes that dangled above the rug. A pair of silver crutches leaned against the armchair beside her, and the soft gleam of a metallic prosthetic leg peeked beneath the folds of her blanket. Her bright blonde hair caught the glow of the fire, haloing her small, curious face. It had been a hard year for the Carters. The accident that took Emily's left leg had also taken her mother. A winter storm on a mountain road, one curve that changed everything. Jack had spent the months since trying to stitch together what remained of their small world, teaching his daughter to walk again on a metal limb while fighting to quiet the ghosts that haunted his own nights. Yet here they were, wrapped in the faint peace of the season, the fire crackling like an old friend, and for a brief moment, the ache in both their hearts seemed to rest. The room carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. A modest Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments uneven but lovingly placed by small hands. Jack's voice was calm as he read aloud from a tattered storybook, the kind soldiers bring home to feel whole again. Every so often, Emily giggled, the pure bell-like sound of a child who had forgotten pain, even if just for a moment. For Jack, those moments were sacred. The world outside could remain frozen, unforgiving. Inside, there was warmth, laughter, and the faint hum of peace. Then, somewhere between a sentence and a heartbeat, came a sound, faint, fragile, yet desperate. Scratch, scratch. It came again, just beyond the door, almost swallowed by the wind. Jack paused mid-word, his instincts tightening like an old reflex. Emily's laughter faded. "Daddy?" she whispered. Jack motioned for her to stay put, his expression sharpening into the quiet alertness of a man who had once lived by reaction. He rose from the rug, his boots creaking softly against the wooden floor, and took the flashlight from the table. The clock above the hearth read 8:46. Few souls would be wandering in a storm like this. When Jack opened the door, the cold surged inward, biting, relentless. Snow swirled in. The threshold, and in the middle of it lay a shape, trembling, heaving, broken. A female German shepherd, her sable coat dark along the back and warm tan across her chest and legs, was caked with snow and streaked with blood. She staggered once before collapsing against the step. In her mouth she carried something small, limp, a tiny puppy, no more than 20 days old, its fur barely sprouted, its chest still rising in weak spasms. Jack froze. He had seen suffering before, the kind that strips away language, but never like this. The mother's eyes lifted toward him, full of pain and something else, a plea. "Daddy, please, Emily's voice cracked through the wind as she struggled up from the rug, crutching her way toward the door. Her small hands trembled as she reached the frame. "We have to help them." Jack knelt, torn between reason and compassion. The animal's breaths came shallow and uneven. He set his flashlight aside, reached forward, and carefully took the tiny puppy into his hands. It was cold, almost weightless, a fading ember in his palms. The mother let out a low whimper, a sound that broke every wall he'd built since war. "All right," he murmured, his voice thick. "All right, we'll help." Inside, the storm faded to a muffled whisper. Jack laid the puppy beside the hearth, then gently lifted the German shepherd into the house. She was heavier than he expected, her body dense with muscle under the grime. Emily fetched an old towel from the kitchen, her limp uneven but determined. "Easy, sweetheart," Jack said as he placed the dog on a wool rug near the fire. Her breathing was ragged, her paws twitching from exhaustion. He checked for wounds, a gash on the flank, scratches along the ribs. Nothing mortal, but deep enough to have drained her strength. Emily hovered close, holding a mug of warm milk with both hands. "For the baby," she whispered. The cabin filled with the scent of wet fur and wood smoke. Jack wrapped the puppy in a soft towel, rubbing gently until faint motions stirred again, a tiny, gasping cry. Emily's eyes lit up. "She's alive, Daddy." The mother stirred at the sound, her head lifting weakly. Jack tilted the cup near her muzzle, and she drank, slow but steady, until her body eased against the floorboards. It was the smallest victory, and yet, in that fragile stillness, it felt like grace itself. Jack leaned back, his muscles relaxing for the first time in hours. The soldier in him had saved countless lives, but this felt different. Emily crouched beside the mother dog, her face full of awe. "She's so brave," she said softly. "She carried her baby through the snow." Jack smiled faintly. "Yeah, some heroes don't wear medals, kiddo." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Can we give them names?" He nodded. "What do you think?" Emily thought for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the mother's tired eyes. "Rex," she said, finally, her voice certain. "It sounds strong, like someone who never gives up. And the baby," she paused, touching the tiny pup's paw. "Hope, because she's little, but she's still fighting." Jack looked at his daughter, at her small hand, her silver crutch resting nearby, and felt something catch in his chest. "Rex and Hope it is," he said. Hours slipped by. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the cabin in silence. The fire burned low, painting everything in shades of amber. Rex began to stir. Her breathing steadied, her body twitched as if waking from a nightmare. When she lifted her head, her gaze found Emily. The little girl had fallen asleep beside her, her crutch lying across her knees, her prosthetic leg gleaming faintly under the firelight. Jack watched as Rex, with a trembling motion, extended her muzzle and licked Emily's hand, a slow, gentle gesture that spoke more than words ever could. Jack sat back on the old couch, the quiet pressing close around him. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, the warmth of life pulsed steady and new. The puppy stirred against its mother's chest. Jack took in the scene, the sleeping child, the recovering dog, the small miracle that had crossed his threshold, and felt the weight of his solitude begin to lift. For years he had built walls around his heart, brick by brick, trying to keep out the memories of comrades lost, of promises broken. But now, in the flicker of that firelight, he felt something thaw. That night, the veteran and his daughter fell asleep beside their unexpected guests. The cabin's old walls creaked under the weight of the cold, yet inside, a strange warmth lingered, the kind that only comes when suffering meets kindness halfway. Before the fire faded to embers, Jack caught one last glimpse of Rex watching him, her amber eyes no longer clouded by fear, but by something deeper, trust. And as he drifted into sleep, he knew, without understanding how, that this Christmas had changed them all. Morning light seeped through the frosted windows of the Carter cabin, soft and pale after a night of storm. The fire had long burned down to embers, but the room still carried the faint warmth of what had been a night of survival, quiet and strange, the kind that changes the air without anyone noticing. Jack Carter stood by the window, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching the snow settle on the empty road outside. Behind him, the rhythmic sound of breathing filled the room. On the rug near the hearth, Rex slept curled around her puppy, Hope, their bodies rising and falling in tandem like waves returning to the same shore. Emily, still in her pink pajamas, knelt beside them with the reverence of someone guarding a miracle. By the time the sun lifted over the ridge, the world outside had gone white and still. Jack pulled on his olive jacket and scarf, the motions deliberate, soldier-like. "We're going to get them checked out," he said softly, not wanting to disturb the fragile calm. Emily nodded, clutching her crutches as she rose. Her prosthetic leg gleamed faintly where the morning light caught it, but her movements were steady now, confident. Jack lifted Rex gently onto the back seat of his truck, wrapped in a blanket, then placed Hope into Emily's arms. The little girl held the puppy close to her chest, whispering something that only children and animals ever understand. As the truck rumbled down the snow-packed road toward town, Rex's head rested near Emily's shoulder, her amber eyes watching the road ahead. The veterinary clinic sat near the edge of Maple Creek, a small building with white siding and a faded red sign that read, "Monroe Animal Care." A wreath hung on the door, though the pine needles had started to fall. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and cedar, with the soft hum of a heater filling the space. Behind the counter stood Dr. Clara Monroe, a woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and calm blue eyes. She wore a wool cardigan over her scrubs, and a small pin shaped like an army cross glinted near her collar. Years in service had etched fine lines around her mouth, not of age, but of memory. Her hands were steady, the kind that had once held wounded soldiers and now tended to wounded strays. "Well, I'll be," she murmured as Jack entered, holding the door for Emily. "I didn't expect to see you on Christmas morning, Jack Carter." Her voice carried both warmth and the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime caring without pause. Jack nodded politely. "Found them last night by the porch. She's hurt bad and the pup's weak." Clara's gaze softened as she peered into Emily's arms. "You did right bringing them here." In the exam room, the light was clean and sharp. Clara worked in silence, moving with practiced ease as she examined Rex. The German shepherd lay still, only twitching when cold instruments touched her fur. Clara's fingers traced gently, along the neck, then stopped. "Here," she said under her breath. Parting the fur, she revealed a faint burned marking, Canine 127, barely visible beneath the scarring. Jack leaned closer, his brows furrowing. "That looks like a registration code," Clara nodded slowly. "It is. She was once part of a unit, law enforcement, maybe military. Canine dogs are tagged like this for identification." Emily tilted her head. "She's a soldier too?" The question was small, innocent, but it hung in the room with unexpected weight. Clara met Jack's eyes before answering. She was, sweetheart, but something happened, something bad. She continued examining the dog, her tone growing heavy. Around Rex's neck were layers of scar tissue, the skin rough and raised in places. The faint punctures along the legs and shoulders suggested repeated injections. Clara pointed to a small patch of fur, darkened and brittle. "See that? That's burn damage. Could be chemical or from heated restraints. And these marks here." She lifted the dog's paw, revealing faint rope abrasions. She was bound, often. Whoever trained her wasn't teaching discipline. They were breaking her. Jack felt his throat tighten. The image of the night before returned. The snow, the staggering body, the puppy in her mouth. "And yet she carried her pup all that way," he said quietly. Clara's eyes softened. "That's what makes her extraordinary." She moved to Hope next, unwrapping the towel and placing the tiny pup on the heated pad. The puppy whimpered softly, nudging against the air. Clara's voice turned gentle again. "She's underweight and chilled. Probably went days without enough milk. I'd say her mother kept her alive with sheer will." Emily reached out, stroking the pup's head with a fingertip. "She didn't give up," she whispered. The clinic was silent except for the sound of instruments being set down and the low hum of the heater. Clara moved back to Rex, checking her heartbeat and temperature. Her motions slowed, deliberate now. "She's been injected with stimulants, probably adrenaline derivatives or performance drugs. These are traces of needles along her flank." She sighed deeply, taking off her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. I've seen this before. Dogs like her. They're taken from service units, sold underground, forced into fighting circuits. They're pushed past exhaustion until their bodies give out. Jack clenched his jaw. There was anger in him, not loud, but deep and old, the kind that comes from seeing too much cruelty in too many uniforms. And she escaped, he murmured. Barely. Clara nodded. Somehow. Maybe she broke free during transport, or maybe someone left her to die. She looked at the puppy again, then at Emily, who was now sitting quietly on the stool, hope tucked inside her coat for warmth. But she didn't die. She came to your door, instead. Rex stirred then, as if hearing them. Her head lifted slightly, her eyes moving from Clara to Jack, then to Emily. The little girl met her gaze, smiling with that innocent certainty only a child could possess. Clara's voice dropped to a near whisper. She didn't come because she was afraid, Jack. She came because she believed there was still someone good left to trust. Jack said nothing. He simply stood there, watching as the snow outside began to fall again, slow, deliberate, quiet. In the reflection of the clinic window, he saw his daughter, her crutch leaning against the wall, her hand resting gently on the dog's paw. The sight struck him in a way nothing else could. Two souls broken in different ways, both still reaching toward light. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done enough for one Christmas, soldier, she said softly. Let me take care of the rest. When they left the clinic, the wind had softened. The truck idled near the curb, its windows fogged from the inside. Emily sat in the back seat, cradling Hope against her coat while Rex rested beside her, now bandaged and breathing evenly. The road ahead stretched white and endless, yet for the first time in months, Jack felt something like hope hum quietly beneath the silence. As the truck moved through the snow, the world around them seemed to pause, as if even the winter itself had decided to listen. The third night came with an uneasy stillness. Maple Creek lay wrapped in its blanket of snow, the moon hanging low and pale above the frozen trees. Inside the Carter cabin, the fire had burned down to a soft red glow, casting long shadows against the walls. Jack sat by the window, a half-finished report open on his laptop, his eyes flicking between lines of text that no longer held his attention. Emily had gone to bed early, tucked under her quilt with Hope nestled beside her pillow. Rex lay near the door, her head resting on her paws, eyes half closed, but never truly asleep. Since the visit to Clara's clinic, something about her had changed. Her ears flicked at every distant sound, her gaze sharper, as if the silence itself could not be trusted. The wind whispered against the siding, and then came a sound that didn't belong. A low growl rolled through the cabin, deep and quiet, coming from Rex's throat. Jack looked up instantly. The dog's body was tense, her muscles coiled beneath the sable coat, her amber eyes fixed on the window near Emily's room. Jack rose slowly, his instincts from the field still sharp. The growl deepened, more warning than rage. He crossed the living room, flashlight in hand, careful not to make noise. The snow outside reflected pale light into the glass, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow where none should be. He slipped on his boots and stepped out into the cold. The night air bit through his jacket, sharp and clean, filled with the faint scent of pine. The only sounds were his own footsteps crunching on the crusted snow and Rex padding silently beside him. He circled the corner of the house, and that's when he saw them. Footprints, clear and deliberate, pressed deep into the snow beneath Emily's window. Not from a neighbor, not from a delivery route. The stride was too long, too heavy, the spacing too controlled. Someone had been standing there, watching. Jack's breath fogged in the air as he crouched to study the pattern. Military boots, or at least the kind sold to those who liked to look the part. The trail ended abruptly near the tree line, swallowed by wind. Back inside, Jack wiped the frost from his gloves and went straight for the security monitor near his desk. The small camera he'd installed last year was still recording, its timestamp blinking steady in the corner. He rewound the footage to just before Rex's growl and let it play. The image was grainy, washed in blue tones from the porch light, but clear enough to see the figure. A man stood near the window, motionless, hood drawn low over his face, gloved hands in his pockets. He didn't move closer, didn't knock, didn't speak. He simply stood there, facing the cabin, for nearly a full minute before turning away. The screen flickered as he disappeared into the dark, and a few seconds later, the faint headlights of a truck swept across the snow. Jack froze the frame and leaned forward. The truck was black, heavy-set, with tinted windows and a dent along the rear fender. Something about it struck a chord, a detail from an old report, a photograph buried in a file he hadn't looked at in years. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. "No," he muttered under his breath. "It can't be." But the memory came anyway. An investigation he'd reviewed after discharge, a network of illegal K-9 training rings disguised as transport companies. One of the vehicles had matched this make and model, registered under a shell company out of Billings. The name on the file had faded, but the darkness behind it had not. He printed a still from the footage, clipped it to his notebook, and called Clara Monroe. Her voice came through the static, weary but alert. "Jack, it's late." "I know," he said quietly. "Someone was outside the cabin tonight." There was a pause. "Did you see them?" "Not clearly. But there's a truck, black tinted windows, same kind that showed up in those illegal unit reports." Clara didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice carried a kind of sorrow that only experience could teach. "If it's them, then they're not just watching, Jack. They're looking for something, or someone." The next morning, the world outside was wrapped in quiet light, the snow reflecting pale gold through the trees. Clara arrived at the cabin just after dawn, her boots crunching softly on the frost. She moved slower these days, but her eyes missed nothing. Inside, Rex greeted her with a low rumble of recognition, tail flicking once. Clara knelt beside her, brushing her hand along the fur near the scarred collarbone. "They'd come back for her," she murmured, half to herself. "I've seen this before. Dogs that were stolen from service lines, the ones that didn't break, those are the ones they want back." Jack showed her the printout from the footage. She studied it under the lamplight, her jaw tightening. "Same kind of vehicle used in the Blackridge case 3 years ago," she said. "They were smuggling ex-military K-9s through rural routes, modifying them with stimulants and illegal training programs. Some of the dogs never survived. The ones that did..." Her eyes lifted toward Rex, who was watching from the doorway, alert and silent. "The ones that did are dangerous only because they remember." The implications sank in slowly. If Rex was marked K9-127, then she wasn't just a stray. She was evidence, a missing piece from a buried operation. Clara's voice softened, but the tremor in it betrayed unease. "They'll want her back. She knows too much. In their way of thinking, even memory is a liability." Jack's hands curled into fists. "Not while she's under my roof." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You can't fight shadows alone, Jack. You need to be careful. Whoever this is, they've already found you." By afternoon, the cabin had grown quiet again, though the air inside felt heavier now, dense with unspoken worry. Jack set up additional cameras, rewired the motion sensors, and checked the locks twice. Emily noticed the change, her small brow furrowed as she played on the rug with hope. "Daddy, why are you fixing everything again?" He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Just making sure we're safe, sweetheart." She nodded, untroubled, and handed him a toy soldier. "He can help too," Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe he will." As dusk settled, he stepped outside once more. The snow was clean again, no tracks this time, just the quiet hum of winter settling into itself. In the distance, a pair of headlights glinted along the county road before vanishing beyond the bend. Jack stood there for a long while, the cold creeping into his gloves, before taking out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts and stopped at a name he hadn't called in years, Deputy Nate Hollis. Nate had been his patrol partner before the war, now a county deputy known for his patience and his quiet way of getting things done. When Nate answered, his voice was the same, calm, grounded. "Jack Carter, been a while." "Yeah," Jack said, exhaling. "Listen, I might have a problem out here. Someone's been watching the cabin. Black truck, same build as the ones tied to those K-9 cases." There was no hesitation on the other end. "You still on Maple Ridge Road?" "Yeah." "All right," Nate replied. "I'll drive by tonight. Keep your lights low and stay inside." Jack thanked him, the relief tempered by a veteran's caution. Nate had been the kind of man who didn't ask for details. He looked, listened, and acted. It was why Jack trusted him now. That night, the wind picked up again, sweeping across the valley in long, mournful gusts. The cabin lights glowed faintly against the snow, a single point of warmth in a vast sea of white. Inside, Emily slept soundly, her crutches leaned neatly against the bedpost. Rex lay near the door once more, her gaze trained on the window as though guarding the very breath of the house. Jack lingered by the fire, listening to the storm and waiting for the distant hum of an engine that might not come. Outside, the world looked peaceful, but in that stillness, every shadow seemed to hold its breath. The following afternoon, Clara Monroe drove up the snowy road to the Carter cabin to check on Rex and Hope. The sky was already heavy with clouds, but the storm had not yet begun. She meant to stay only a short while, just long enough to make sure the animals were healing well. But as the light faded, the wind began to rise, and snow came faster than anyone expected, thick, blinding, and relentless. Within an hour, the road back to town was gone, buried under drifts of white. Jack insisted she stay the night, knowing it was too dangerous to leave. And so, as darkness fell and the storm gathered its strength, Clara remained inside the small cabin with Jack and Emily, unaware that before dawn, the quiet would be broken by something far worse than the wind. The night deepened until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, faint and muffled through the snow, came a sound that did not belong, the low rumble of an engine laboring through the drifts. Jack's head lifted instantly. Clara looked toward the window, her brow furrowed. The noise grew louder, closer, until the glare of headlights cut through the white curtain beyond the gate. A black truck, large, heavy, its wheels churning ice, rolled to a stop at the edge of the property. The lights dimmed, the engine died, and silence settled like a warning. 3 figures stepped out, their outlines sharp against the storm, each one carrying a flashlight and something darker, the metallic glint of rifles slung at their sides. Jack didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt beside Emily. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his voice calm but taut. "We're going to the back. Stay quiet and hold on to me." Emily blinked awake, confused but obedient, clutching her crutches as Jack scooped her up. Clara had already moved toward the kitchen, grabbing her emergency radio from her bag. Rex was at the door now, muscles rigid, a low growl vibrating through her chest. Hope whimpered softly from Emily's arms. Jack turned toward the back window, the faint outline of the old shed visible through the swirling snow, the one he'd reinforced years ago, lined with steel for storms and storage. It would have to do. They stepped out into the blizzard, the wind slashing at their faces like knives. Jack moved fast but careful, boots crunching against the snow while keeping Emily close to his chest. Clara followed, her scarf whipping around her face, clutching the small medical kit and radio to her chest. Rex stayed close, her body pressed low against the storm, eyes darting toward every movement. By the time they reached the shed, the truck doors had slammed shut, and the faint glow of flashlights began to sweep across the yard. Jack pushed open the heavy wooden door and ushered everyone inside. The interior was cold and dim, smelling of oil and timber. He slid the steel latch across the door, locking it from within. Inside the shelter, breath came in visible clouds. Jack loaded a single round into the chamber of his rifle, his motion steady, rehearsed. "Clara," he said quietly, "radio Nate. Tell him we've got movement at the house." She nodded, twisting the dial until the static cleared. Her old hands trembled slightly, but her voice when it came was strong. "This is Dr. Monroe, emergency code 22, sending coordinates now." A faint crackle answered from the other end, a dispatcher confirming receipt. Jack exhaled, the relief brief but real. Outside, heavy boots crunched against the snow, moving closer. Rex's growl deepened. The first blow hit the front door of the cabin with a sound that echoed through the storm, wood splintering under the force of a steel boot. Then another, louder. A gunshot followed, sharp and violent, its echo carried by the wind. Emily flinched, clutching Hope tighter. "It's okay," Jack whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. "They're not getting in here." But his voice held an edge he couldn't hide. Through the small window slit, the beam of a flashlight swept past, followed by muffled shouts. The intruders were inside the yard now, One of them shouted something, short, angry, and a second shot rang out, this one closer. Rex barked, a sound that cut through the noise like a blade, raw and defiant. The next impact shook the shed door, though the steel held. Jack aimed the rifle toward the window and fired once into the air, a warning shot. The crack echoed through the snow, sending one of the flashlights tumbling as the men ducked for cover. Clara's voice came through the static again, faint but urgent. "Nate's on his way. He said to hold position until you hear sirens." Jack nodded, reloading. Another thud rattled the back wall, and a sharp crash followed, the sound of glass breaking. One of them had found the cabin's side window. Jack's heart kicked hard in his chest. "They're trying to flank us," he muttered. He moved toward the noise, keeping low. The shed had a second door leading into the main hallway, and through the narrow gap he saw movement, a shadow climbing through the broken frame. The intruder landed clumsily, shaking off the snow, then froze when the cold muzzle of Jack's rifle met his shoulder. "Don't," Jack said, his voice low but steady. The man hesitated, eyes darting behind the mask, then lunged. A mistake. Jack twisted the rifle, driving him against the wall with the strength of a man who'd fought for his life before. They struggled for a brief, brutal second until the intruder's weapon clattered to the floor. Jack pinned him, wrenching his arm behind his back. "It's over," he hissed. In the chaos, Clara had returned to the radio, pressing the transmit button hard. "Suspect down, shots fired, immediate backup requested," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the static. Outside, the last two men shouted in panic, realizing their advantage was gone. One fired toward the shed door. A loud, splintering crack followed, and a single bullet ricocheted off the latch, grazing Rex's shoulder. She yelped but didn't back away. Instead, she moved forward, planting herself squarely between the door and Emily, barking in furious bursts, her body trembling with both pain and resolve. Jack turned, saw the blood on her fur, and felt something hot rise in his throat. The distant wail of sirens broke through the storm like salvation. The flashlights outside jerked once, then disappeared as two of the men bolted toward the road, their dark shapes fading into the blizzard. Jack exhaled, lowering his rifle, his pulse pounding in his ears. The man he'd restrained lay face down, breathing hard, his gloved hands bound with a strip of torn canvas. Clara knelt beside Rex, pressing a clean cloth to the wound. "It's shallow," she murmured. "She'll be all right." Emily, wide-eyed but steady, reached out and stroked Rex's head. The dog leaned into her touch, tail flicking weakly as the sirens grew louder. By the time Deputy Nate Hollis arrived, the snow had begun to ease. Red and blue lights painted the drifts in fleeting color. Officers fanned out across the yard, flashlights sweeping the ground for tracks. Jack stood by the shed door, his breath rising in the cold, while Nate, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face cut from calm stone, approached with quiet gravity. "You all safe?" he asked. Jack nodded once. "Mostly." Nate glanced toward the bound man, then at Rex, who still sat alert despite the bandage. "She did good," he said softly. Jack followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he replied, voice low. "She always does." When the last cruiser pulled away, the world fell silent again. The snow whispered across the yard, erasing the footprints, smoothing over the violence of the night. Inside the cabin, the fire was gone cold, but the air felt strangely alive, filled with the pulse of something neither fear nor relief, but gratitude. Rex lay beside Emily, her head resting against the child's lap, eyes closing at last. Hope nestled beside them, breathing softly. Jack sat near the window, the rifle across his knees, watching the storm fade. The night had broken more than just the door. It had tested every bond in that house and found none of them weak. Morning broke over Maple Creek with a clarity the town hadn't seen in months. The storm had passed, and what remained was a fragile stillness, the kind that follows chaos and asks what must be rebuilt. Smoke rose gently from the Carter cabin's chimney, curling into the crisp winter air. The police cruisers were gone now, leaving behind only tracks in the snow and the faint scent of oil. Inside, the warmth had returned. Jack sat at the kitchen table, head bowed over a cup of coffee gone cold, while Rex lay stretched beside Emily's chair, her bandaged shoulder rising and falling with steady breath. Hope nuzzled into her mother's fur, sleeping peacefully. The night's terror had ended, but its echo lingered in the broken door, the scattered glass, and the quiet determination that filled the house like light after long darkness. By mid-morning, the investigation began in earnest. Deputy Nate Hollis moved through the yard with a small team, their boots crunching across the snow. The arrested intruder sat in the back of a cruiser, head bowed, wrists cuffed. Nate leaned in through the open door, his tone calm but firm. "You can make this easy," he said. "Tell us where the others went." The man hesitated, his breath visible in the cold. Then, perhaps realizing the futility of silence, he spoke. Names, routes, coordinates, every word was recorded, every detail added to the puzzle. Inside, Jack watched through the window, the soldier in him reading the body language and knowing it was truth. The black truck had been part of something larger, something buried deep enough to fester unseen. Within 48 hours, the pieces began to align. Police traced the vehicle to an abandoned property outside Helena, a cluster of barns disguised as a rescue facility. What they found inside was far from mercy. Rows of cages lined the concrete floor, the air thick with ammonia and despair. Dogs of every breed, German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, even retrievers, sat in silence, their eyes hollow but alert. Some bore fresh wounds, others carried old scars that told of restraint and exhaustion. It took 3 trucks and a dozen volunteers to empty the place, every animal lifted into warmth for the first time in years. Clara Monroe was there, her hands trembling as she checked each pulse, whispering softly to every creature she touched. Nate directed the operation with quiet precision, while Jack stood watch near the entrance, the wind tugging at his coat, Rex by his side, watching too. Among the recovered files was a single record that froze Clara's heart, a faded logbook stamped Federal K-9 Program. Inside it, the number 127 appeared beside a name, Rex, Search and Rescue Division, Glacier Unit. There it was, proof that she had once been part of a disaster response team, trained for mountain rescue, stolen during a transfer years earlier. Clara showed the file to Jack, her voice thick with emotion. "She wasn't born into pain," she said. "She was taken from duty, from saving lives." Jack's jaw tightened, eyes softening as he looked at the dog resting nearby. "Then she found her way home again," he murmured. It wasn't triumph he felt, but something deeper, a quiet reverence for endurance, for the way survival could still find grace. News of the raid spread quickly through the county. People in Maple Creek, a town small enough that nothing stayed hidden for long, began showing up at Clara's clinic with blankets, food, and open hands. Retired farmers offered space in their barns. Students built temporary kennels. Even the mayor sent a donation, his note simple: "No creature deserves to live unseen." It was Clara who proposed the idea first, her eyes lit with that familiar fire of purpose. "We can't send them all away," she said to Jack and Nate over coffee in the clinic's back room. "They need a place, somewhere safe, somewhere that teaches them trust again." Nate nodded slowly. "A haven," he said. Jack leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. "Rex's haven," he suggested. And that's what it became. By spring, Rex's haven stood at the edge of town, a converted barn surrounded by fenced meadows and the sound of new beginnings. Wooden signs painted by local children marked each kennel with the rescued dogs' names. Volunteers came and went, bringing laughter, patience, and the kind of love that healed quietly. Jack managed the grounds, his steady hands repairing fences and fitting harnesses. Clara handled the medical care, moving through her days with renewed vigor, while Nate oversaw the security, not because danger still lingered, but because he understood that safety, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Rex roamed freely among the kennels, no longer a patient, but a guardian. Wherever she went, the other dogs followed. Hope grew stronger by the week, learning the world with curious eyes and a tail that never stopped moving. Summer brought the first open day, a modest gathering beneath the bright Montana sky. Families came to meet the dogs, each one bearing a story of rescue and rediscovery. Jack watched as children knelt in the grass, their laughter echoing through the yard, while Rex rested under the shade tree beside Emily. The little girl's prosthetic leg gleamed in the sun as she brushed a hand over Rex's head. "She's teaching them to trust again," she said softly. Jack smiled, the pride in his eyes gentle but sure. For a long moment, he allowed himself to simply watch, not as a soldier, but as a man who had learned that healing often begins with the smallest acts of kindness. In autumn, the town held a ceremony before the courthouse, not grand but heartfelt. A wooden plaque was unveiled, bearing the words, "Rex, the silent hero of Maple Creek." The mayor, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, spoke of courage and loyalty, of how one animal's endurance had exposed an injustice and restored faith to an entire community. When Rex stepped forward beside Jack, wearing a simple ribbon around her neck, the crowd rose in applause. Cameras clicked, and for once the sound didn't make her flinch. She stood tall, the sunlight catching the tan of her coat, her gaze steady and calm. Clara wept quietly, and Nate, standing beside her, removed his hat in respect. That winter, snow returned to Maple Creek, but this time it carried no fear. Inside the Carter cabin, the fire burned bright, casting warm light across the familiar faces gathered around it. Emily, now 6, sat curled on the rug with Rex and Hope pressed against her sides. Jack sat in his chair, one hand resting over his dog tags, the other turning a page in the storybook he'd once read aloud. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon, and laughter came easily. Outside, the town's Christmas lights shimmered across the snow like a promise kept. As the night grew still, Emily leaned closer to her father, her voice soft as a whisper. "Daddy," she said, her small hand stroking Rex's fur, "I think God sent her so we could learn how to love again." Jack looked down at her, at the child who had taught him the same, and felt a warmth rise in his chest that no winter could ever take. He didn't answer, not in words, but the look in his eyes said everything. Beside them, Rex lifted her head, meeting his gaze with quiet knowing. The fire crackled softly, and outside, Maple Creek slept beneath the calmest snow it had seen in years. Maybe what happened in that small cabin of Maple Creek wasn't just a rescue. It was a quiet reminder of what love looks like when it costs something. A wounded dog carrying her pup through the storm. A father and his little girl opening their door without hesitation. In that moment, compassion crossed every boundary between man and animal, between pain and forgiveness. Jack didn't save Rex out of duty, and Rex didn't protect them for reward. They simply recognized the same light in each other. That is how kindness works, unseen, unspoken, yet strong enough to change the world. If this story touched your heart, share it. Tell us what it made you feel, and subscribe to walk with us through more stories of silent courage and human grace. May God bless you in every soul that still believes in goodness.